Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hey.
Today we are wrapping up our Afrofuturism series, where we read Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, and Colson Whitehead's The Intuitionist. If this is your first time listening to us, you can listen to those episodes by finding them in our archives, and you can join our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. And if you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's also in our episode description. Next week, we'll be starting a new series, The Impossibility of a New Home, with Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World. So, Iad, throughout this series, you've been thinking about what Afrofuturism actually is.
Right. For me, I think in order to really discuss this thing meaningfully, we have to be clear about what it is and what it entails. And we had talked a lot about this when we were discussing Parable of the Sower, what exactly this genre means. And I think that there was disagreement between all of us, especially between me and you two, about this genre. And the more I think about it, the more it troubles me. It seems to require a certain kind of essentialism. I think it requires people to believe that there is an essence of Black or at least non-white people. This, I think, because if you insist on foregrounding and depicting Blackness as we know it now in the future, doesn't that have to mean that there is something specifically Black that will carry over into that future? And if we insist on this racial difference and if we insist on this essence, doesn't that just kind of continue and reify that difference? So I think that we have varying degrees of essentialism in these three novels. The first example in Parable of the Sower that I see is that Lauren's group, it seems to be Black or quote unquote Black in the sense that the group that she has arranged operates as a sort of tribal society. This, I think, is the very stereotypical image of Black as primitive or Black as less civilized than white society. First of all, as we had talked about in that episode, I don't know if Octavia Butler would consider herself Afrofuturist, but I also don't know if she would appreciate the idea that Black society is primitive tribal society. Do you think that Parable of the Sower fits into Afrofuturism in that way?
I think it fits into Afrofuturism. I see where you're going with the tribalism, but I see the tribalism differently in that book. It's not tribalism as a us versus them because we're better. It's us versus them because if there isn't an us versus them, we will die. That it's a strict survivalist tactic. It might change in the sequel, but at least in this book, it does not seem to adhere to strict race boundaries.
I don't think the race is important in Butler. As we had talked about previously, I think Butler is an advocate of post-racial politics. But I also don't think that the tribalism in the novel is really a matter of us being better than them, but rather us being us because we protect each other, and us being tribal because of the absence of higher levels of social organization. They operate as a group on a very primitive level. They help each other because if they don't help each other, they'll die. There isn't any sophisticated art or culture involved.
Doesn't that turn the idea of this higher technological system being better on its head?
I would say no. I would say that having a more advanced culture, or a more, rather than advanced, you could say an elaborate culture, is never a detriment. I think that when you have the ability to protect yourself, but also have art and culture and sophisticated things like that, it's always a benefit. It's a net positive.
But my point is that it doesn't exist in the world of this book.
It previously did. When they were living in the compound, they had something closer to that. I think there is a division in that novel between when they're living in the compound and when they left.
So I'm arguing because I do think you are onto something, but I also think there's a big difference here between arguing for tribalism just for the sake of tribalism versus arguing for tribalism in absence of anything else because nothing else exists. Yes, they were living in this village before, but that village is destroyed by outside forces. And as far as we can tell, yes, there is order in certain places, but that order is constantly being destroyed by outside forces. And at the end of the book, they return to some kind of order.
So I have a question here, Yed. One thing I'm not clear about. Are you saying that the tribalism is in opposition to Afrofuturism? Is that what you're saying here?
I would say that the essence, the African essence that somebody could read into this novel is the fact that Lauren's group behaves as a quote-unquote primitive tribal society. Now, I'm not saying that Butler advocates this, but I'm saying if we are trying to read Afrofuturism as containing some sort of essence, if it's an essentialist genre, where do we find that essence in the text that we've looked at?
I would argue also against it being tribalist in a classical sense, in that they are welcoming to anyone that comes along, as long as they're not murderous, drug-fueled anarchists.
I think that's true.
It's hard for me to square the two. I see what you're saying, Yed, that you're trying to get at the essence of something, I guess, can we say black or African? But you also claim that it's primitive. That's where I'm not sure. I do agree that it's different from what we understand as civilization that is presented to us in, let's say, Mumbo Jumbo. Like, you have in Mumbo Jumbo a very sophisticated kind of essential blackness, whereas here you could say it's mainly fight or flight. But I don't think it's primitive, just because primitive makes it sound like it's undesirable.
Like, I absolutely don't think that Butler would want her novel to portray Black people as primitive. When I use that word, I'm just saying if we're trying to understand what the society is like, how can we really gesture towards the difference between the society after they leave the compound and the society before? And they do exist in a very distinct way. And I don't think that I want to cast it in a pejorative light, because in fact, when they talk about modern day slavery in the rest of the novel, that is more quote unquote civilized, but also much more inhumane. So I don't think it's a matter of one being better than the other, but in the stereotypical sense, when we think of a tribal society versus a nation state, we do tend to use that word primitive, if only because we imagine the tribal society progressing at some point to the nation state.
Sure, but why not, for example, talk about the communal aspects of it? You know, instead of looking at it through this kind of matrix of primitive village life and advanced city life. In our discussion of Octavia Butler's book, we talked about Fordism.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why not look at it from that angle, from this kind of communal angle? Like, isn't there something essentially Black there?
You could. I mean, I wouldn't say that necessarily tribal society is essentially Black, but I think in the collective imagination, when most people think of African societies, I think they tend towards the idea of tribal societies rather than communal societies. I don't think that your suggestion is wrong. I just think that the more clearer essence that most people would find in this novel would probably be their tribal behavior. But your point is absolutely true as well. if we could just move forward to the other two novels, I think that we see a different sort of essence in Mumbo Jumbo. In Mumbo Jumbo, I think the African essence that we find is that when people catch this Just Grew virus, they become prone to dancing and partying. In that sense, it seems to carry the positive aspect of this quote unquote Black essence, where Black people are supposedly more rhythmic and more musical and more prone to entertainment. But it also carries the negative connotation that Black people are lazier and less hardworking and so on. So it carries a kind of mixed bag of associations with it. But I think that the idea that this is somehow the African essence is clear enough to me.
I don't remember if we have talked about this in past episodes, but Ishmael Reed's book definitely feels like it goes to this heart of Black being a stand-in for the more magical and illogical, I guess, versus white being this rigid, logic-based thing. We did talk about that with Whitehead's book about the whole white empiricism versus Black intuitionism. I think we see that pretty clearly in Mumbo Jumbo.
Yeah, I think that you can extend the Just Grew kind of interest in dancing and partying to the more general sentiment that Black people are more sensual, more earthy, more magical, as opposed to whiteness, which is logical and rigid and repressed and so on. Like, I think that these ideas are very much part of our general way of thinking about race, for better or for worse. So, in the general sense, my question is, should these differences be preserved? Because if we are promoting this genre as a vision of the future, but we are reiterating these racial differences, are we continuing the current problem? Are we continuing the current essentialist, reductionist, oversimplified ways of thinking about race into the future? On the other hand, we could say that if we imagine a post-racial future, it's been argued that post-racial futures that we see in the media, like in Star Trek, are not really post-racial. They're just white futures, because the future that they have imagined is just one where the non-white features have been erased.
I think that's true. I think a lot of the things we see in sci-fi media, especially, sci-fi movies, certainly in many books, most of those sci-fi ideas are the white world. They don't include Blackness as an afterthought.
Well, we did read a post-racial novel that was not focused on white culture. It was so good that I don't even remember the name of it. It was set on Mars.
Oh,
it was called
Vagabonds.
Yes, Vagabonds. I mean, I'd say that was an attempt at a post-racial future where the Chinese were the dominant culture being represented.
That novel was not successful, but probably not successful for other reasons. But in general, I do think it's probably true that when we present a quote-unquote universal future, the universality that we find is really just whiteness being preserved and non-whiteness being erased. But we might also say, if that's a problem, when we desire to preserve racial difference, are we preserving difference just for difference's sake?
I think there's a hybrid in there that should be possible. I think it's possible to have, I wouldn't call it post-racial. I don't even know if that's something that makes sense to strive for. I'm the wrong person to ask about that. But I think it's certainly possible for us to move toward that while also still acknowledging our histories and acknowledging the different cultures and where we came from, without erasing those pasts, without erasing those cultures. And if we look at a also, white imagined future, but Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry loved to parade himself as a post-racial creator. There's evidence in those stories of differences in culture existing while still somehow getting along together.
So maybe this is a step too far afield, but what would make Star Trek a more Afrocentric post-racial show? Like, would you need more Geordie dancing? Like, what are we talking about here?
I don't think it can be Afrocentric and post-racial at the same time.
Well, what I'm saying is the contention is that it's actually a white vision of the future, and obviously the creator is white. But is there something essentially white about it? Like, that's the question, because if you're saying that what's the post-racial futures that are given to us in popular culture are white futures, which I don't disagree with, but I'm just saying, well, what does it mean then? Like, if you take Star Trek, because we've all watched Star Trek, like, what does that mean? What makes it essentially white and not black?
I think you kind of are moving toward it with Geordie dancing, that I think the argument is that we imagine this future of post-racial because we don't want to deal with race. So we imagine it as this, everyone gets along and there's no problems. Race is an issue of the past, but we also don't see any expressions, or rarely see any expressions of race. And what we're left with, especially with something like Star Trek, is a very orderly thing. It's all this imperialist vision of the world. It's a federation, I guess, but it seems to operate the same way that, say, the US has always operated.
Yeah, it's organized in the kind of military hierarchy that we see in our present United States. Like, we have commanders and lieutenants, and it's very hierarchical. I think somebody could say that it's much more hierarchical and top-down rather than communal, which somebody might say is more stereotypically black or stereotypically non-white.
There's also, I've read, in preparing for this, I've read a few things that talked about how the treatment of aliens in any media is also a kind of mirror for how we treat other races. That there's this alienness that comes along with sci-fi. Especially if you have white sci-fi, you can read into it that the aliens are other races. How we treat those alien races is a reflection of how we treat non-whiteness.
This kind of erasure of non-white characteristics is fine. Like, we can talk about this, whether or not it's happening in Star Trek, but in general, my question still stands. Like, if there is such a thing as essence, and that essence is erased, that's a problem. But if there is no essence to preserve, then there should be no reason to preserve difference, because that difference is just a symptom of present-day inequality. And if we move towards a quote-unquote universal utopian future, why would there need to be racial difference? If we are aiming towards that, why would racial difference continue to exist? Moving forward a bit, I think that we see Afrofuturism as kind of caught between these two problems: the limiting essentialism that we might find in something like Mumbo Jumbo, and this kind of imagined post-racial future, which is just the erasure of blackness that we see in something like Star Trek. I found the very interesting essay by J. Griffith Rawlinson about this topic, and he calls it the Robot Voodoo Power Thesis. And this thesis is based on what he calls anti-essentialism. This reminds me very much of what James had said in our previous episode about Mumbo Jumbo. You had said that Ishmael Reed kind of flips the script by associating history with blackness and myth with whiteness. So Rolifson kind of uses a similar idea, but rather than just flipping the associations, what he's advocating is collapsing the distinction. So he uses examples from music, but I think the idea still holds that in music, we have somebody like Sun Ra, the musician, who talks about myth science. So it's not just myth on one hand and science on the other, but the combination of the two in one thing. And we also have Kool Keith, who talks about robot voodoo, which is the mixture of a black coded thing with a white coded thing in one place. And I think that this is a very interesting way of navigating these two potential pitfalls of Afrofuturism, because it allows the genre to keep its critical power, but not be a universalist white dream and not be an essentialist limiting factor. Do you think that these problems that we've been talking about can be solved by combining both the black coded thing and the white coded thing in one place? Is this really the most effective way for Afrofuturism to move forward?
I think it makes sense to me. Reading this essay, it reminded me a lot of a couple different things. It reminded me first of that Haraway Cyborg Manifesto that we read earlier and have already talked about in this series. Instead of taking a binary approach to things, taking this hybrid view. That certainly seems to be what Rolifson is advocating, or at least saying what Afrofuturism is all about. The other thing it reminded me of, when we were doing our Race in Contemporary America series, we read a couple books on passing. Rolifson talks about the need for Black people to have two identities, or at least have this double consciousness. And we've seen that in other books. And he talks about that as a thing you see in Afrofuturism a lot, or not even a double consciousness. It's more that identity is fluid and it isn't necessarily fixed on one thing. He mentioned, for example, Kool Keith. His identity would change with each new album. I think the point is that Afrofuturism, as we've talked about at the very beginning of this series, doesn't necessarily have to be one thing. This seems like a good idea for Afrofuturism to me, that it can be this hybridization, that could be a good way to move forward.
I think that this hybridization that you're calling it was best exemplified by The Intuitionist by Colson Whitehead, because as I mentioned when we're discussing that, we have this kind of Uncle Tom character, Pompey, who turns out to be innocent. And we have another character who seems like a more quote-unquote authentic black man, Natchez, who is actually more deceitful than Pompey. So we have this reversal, but then we have Lila May in the middle coming to grips with the fact that her image of authentic black behavior failed her, but her image of this quote-unquote Uncle Tom character is also loathsome to her. So there is this kind of move to negotiate a new way of being that is present in that novel, which I think is probably a result of Colson Whitehead's very unique upbringing, because he is not from the typical Black American household. He grew up on Long Island. He grew up in New York. He's from a very rich family. He's not the typical Black American. So I think that he has that kind of hybrid identity that, Rolifson might say is necessary for Afrofuturist works to navigate between these two pitfalls.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot in that book, as you've pointed out. It seems to me that his stance is that adherence to strict tribalism isn't that simple. That the world, especially today's world, is much more complicated than that. We've talked about how these books are really different from each other. They do seem to have very different views on the Black diaspora and its place in the future. Parable of the Sower shows this future that arguably depends on community building, determination, and cooperation, not just within the Black community, but across all races. We see that the plight of one is the plight of all. In the Intuitionist, the future is one where Black people must use guile and subterfuge to get ahead, and that deliverance and ascension as a people is a difficult and perhaps naive task, though one still worth fighting for, even if the world isn't quite ready for it yet. And then finally, in Mumbo Jumbo, we have a recentering of history on Africa with an assertion that the future of Black people depends on understanding its past, seemingly from an Africa-centered viewpoint. Is there anything we can point to as a consensus among these books? Is there some kind of agreed-on idea of what Afrofuturism is or conveys that we see here?
What I've been kind of thinking about here is, once again, the idea of community, because I think there is some semblance of community in Mumbo Jumbo, and you obviously see it in Parable of the Sower. And with the Intuitionist, it's a little bit difficult because Lila May is positioned as someone outside of the community. That's what I talked about when we talked about the Intuitionist, is what's interesting to me is how much she is an outsider. She very much does not belong in the community. So in a way, I think all three books do talk about community, but except in the case of the Intuitionist, the main character is placed outside of one. I think there's something here about the relationship of insider and outsider, of the need to be in a community and what it's like to be outside of a community. I think you can read or look at all three books through that lens.
Do you think that if Lila May were inside of a community, that she would have been as easily deceived by Pompey and Natchez?
It's a hard question to answer because in the book, it's established that she has never really been a part of the community. Even in her interactions with her dad, she is seen as scared and kind of in opposition to him in a way. So from the book, what I get from it is she has always been an outsider of some sort. So I'm not sure, because what makes her this plucky protagonist is the fact that she has this distrustful attitude, I guess, toward everyone. This need to belong, but this inability to belong for some reason that's not really clear.
There's this feeling of the society thinking that it's post-racial, when, as the book moves forward, it's very clear that it's not. That's something that she discovers early on in her career, but it's revealed to us, the reader, much more as we move forward through the book. We don't see that at first at the beginning. We see her as someone that's held up as this special person, as not necessarily an outsider, but someone embraced as this person who's great at her work. But you're right, as the book progresses, it's very clear that she's an outsider in all senses to everyone.
Something that's interesting that has come from this discussion is how my view of Pompey, or my understanding of Pompey as a character, has changed because of this conversation, because he is very much an insider in that he belongs, and I'm saying this with like air quotes because he's obviously still not really someone who belongs, but he does belong with all the other elevator inspectors. And when you see him at his home, he very obviously belongs to that neighborhood where he's living, whereas Lila May does not. But at the same time, when she talks to him, it becomes clear that he had to really fight to belong, that he is still seen as an outsider by all the other elevator inspectors. So kind of hearkening back to what we were talking about before, he is a kind of hybrid too, where he belongs, but he also doesn't belong.
One thing that I thought was strange in this book is that it's mostly about race, that it focuses on how she's the first Black woman to get this position and that she's good at it. But we don't actually see any other women of any race in her position, right? We don't see any other women inspectors. I bring that up because that seems to be just as much of a way that she's an outsider as anything else.
So she's doubly excluded.
Right. But like you bring up Pompey, I get the sense that Pompey is half accepted because he's a man.
Yeah. So to your question of a consensus and what it means. So this idea that I've been kind of revolving around is this idea of community, of belonging, because what Afrofuturism is, in my mind, is this carving out of a safe space, this need to create a situation where people belong.
I think my view is a little bit different. If we're talking about something that all three novels have in common, I would say it's a way of protecting minorities from being overrun by quote unquote universal values and universal character types. When it comes to the Intuitionist and Mumbo Jumbo, it's quite clear to me that that is protecting Blackness from being overrun by whiteness. When it comes to Parable of the Sower, I don't think it's necessarily protecting Blackness, but rather protecting minorities of any sort from just the hegemonic powers in the America that Octavia Butler imagines. How can people protect themselves from this world gone crazy with drugs, but also from this world gone crazy with capitalism and this world gone crazy with modern day slavery? So I think Lauren is very much concerned with how she can find her people and protect her people from those problems. And Ishmael Reed and, by extension, Papa Labar are very concerned with protecting Black people from Atonists and, by extension, white people. I think that in The Intuitionist, Whitehead does skew it a little bit, only because I don't think that it's a matter of protecting Blackness from whiteness, but rather a method of finding a new way of Blackness to relate to whiteness, because the confrontational attitude that we might see in something like Mumbo Jumbo is something that I think Whitehead very much opposes.
Okay, let's take a break now. When we come back, we'll talk about how we feel about Afrofuturism. Welcome back. So now that we have read 3 books, would you want to read more Afrofuturism?
Absolutely love to read more.
Why?
I feel like we didn't actually get into it very much. I think we talked a lot about the ideas around it and the, as you put it, the proto-Afrofuturist texts. But I think we've only scratched the surface here. One of the things that really intrigues me about this whole genre is that it's not just sci-fi. That sci-fi in general is this kind of wide open ocean, and there's not much focus to it. You can have a science fiction novel about anything. But with Afrofuturism, there are very specific problems, that additional problems that you're wrestling with. And I find those issues really interesting and important.
You would.
I mean, this is Sam Catnip, after all.
I would be willing to read one of the more contemporary novels, just because I think we are reading texts here that are Afrofuturists without believing that they are so. And I would like to read a contemporary novel where the author more or less set out to write this type of novel from the beginning and see if that changes my opinion. I think that it was a very interesting source of discussion for these past few episodes, just because it brings up a whole lot of ideas about how such a genre could be formed. But in terms of actually reading this type of work just to enjoy it and not to think so critically about it, I don't know if I would find as much enjoyment here as I would find in other genres.
What about you, James?
Only if it's written by a white male.
With dreadlocks?
Yeah. I guess yes, but I wouldn't be enthused about it. I actually wonder, this is what it made me think about, is if this is going to spur a whole bunch of ex-futurism genres, like Eskimo futurism.
No. I don't think so at all, because I think that Black people specifically have this kind of future robbed from them. I think that if we talked about an Asian future, people would say, oh yeah, probably. If we talked about a European future, people would say, well, we already kind of have that. If we talked about a Middle Eastern future, it would seem a little bit unusual, but I don't think that people would think it was as specifically important as a Black future. I think the role of imagining a Black future is much more important than any other race.
Well, my pushback here would be, I was kind of joking with Eskimo, but not really. Like, native people have been forgotten, even in your list of people that you just listed.
Well, sure. I can't list every different group. I mean, yes, native people have been neglected, but I don't think that they are as specifically present in our cultural imagination as a group of people who are missing their future.
This is what we talked about in There. The point of a lot of Native American fiction right now is how they are still here and not like the cowboy and Indians on TV or people on the res or whatever.
Right. Not even at the point of concerned with the future. It's more concerned with the present.
Right. I guess that's what I mean here, Sam, is that, native people are probably more missing their present than missing their future. When we think about Black people, we do imagine a huge continent full of Black people. It's just that we don't imagine them having any role in shaping the future or existing in the future. Their existence just seems very much of the past.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I do wonder. I think that I could see the movement away from this white, Western-centric sci-fi. And sci-fi thus far has been very much dominated by the West. So I think even though this reason for being may not be present, I could see that kind of genre blossoming. And I could see myself being interested in that kind of genre, not more than Afrofuturism, but as interested. Because like with Vagabonds, which once again we all didn't like, this idea of a Chinese-centered view of the future is interesting.
When we do turn to Africa, we see the novels mostly coming out of Nigeria and South Africa, because those are where the markets are. But hopefully soon we are going to see more from other countries that we don't hear from very often.
Well, we will be reading novels from Nigerian authors soon-ish. It's going to be on our schedule on Reddit. Thank you for listening. Next week, we will start our new series, The Impossibility of a New Home, with a review of Science Preceding the End of the World by Yuri Herrera. We've also got an updated reading schedule, which you can find on Reddit. at CanonicalPod. We post threads for our book club every Friday on Reddit. If you'd like to talk with us, that's where you can go. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you liked this episode and enjoy our podcast, please go ahead and leave us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. That helps other people find our podcast. Till next time, happy reading. We will talk to you soon.